The stadium was shaking. Lights blazed against the stage, guitars wailed, and thousands of voices rose together in a roar that felt more like an earthquake than an audience. At the center stood Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, larger than life, draped in white and gold, commanding every eye in the room. And then he stopped. The music cut. The crowd froze. For a moment, time itself seemed to hold its breath. Elvis had turned his gaze away from the glittering lights and the screaming fans and fixed it on a single face in the sea of people. A young woman, silent tears running down her cheeks. She wasn't singing along. She wasn't shouting his name. She wasn't even moving with the rhythm. She couldn't. She was deaf. In a place built on sound, she lived in silence. And yet, she had come anyway, drawn not by the promise of music she could hear, but by the presence of the man who made the world move. She came to feel him. Through the vibration of the floor, the sight of his lips, the energy of his being, Elvis saw her, truly saw her. And in that instant, the king did what no one expected. He walked across the stage, reached down and took her hand. The noise of the crowd became background to something infinitely more intimate. He leaned close, his voice softening, and began to sing, not to the thousands, not to the cameras, but to her alone. The audience erupted into stunned silence, then into tears, then into thunderous applause. Because in a world deafened by spectacle, Elvis had chosen connection. This was not just another performance, not another record-breaking night. It was something that stripped away the lights, the fame, the crown. It was Elvis Presley, the man, giving his soul to someone who could never hear it, yet could feel it more deeply than anyone else. That night became a story retold for decades. A moment when the king of rock and roll showed that his true power was not in the volume of his voice, but in the weight of his compassion. To understand why this mattered, why it still echoes through time, we have to go back. To Elvis's beginnings, to the values that shaped him, to the way he carried the lessons of his mother and the scars of his childhood into every concert hall. Because when the world remembers Elvis Presley, it remembers the music, the fame, the legend. But when it remembers this night, it remembers the silence, Elvis Presley. To many, the name itself is thunder. He wasn't just a singer. He was a storm. From the moment he first stepped onto the stage in the 1950s, he didn't just sing songs, he shook the very ground of American culture. He was dangerous, electrifying, a man who could make teenagers scream and parents gasp with nothing more than a swivel of his hips. But beyond the glittering jumpsuits, the sold-out arenas, and the millions of records sold, there was another Elvis, one far quieter, far gentler. A man who carried with him the lessons of his humble upbringing, the values instilled by his mother Gladys, who taught him that every single human being, no matter how rich or poor, no matter what they had or lacked, deserved dignity. Elvis never forgot that. This was the Elvis who would stop his limousine to give a stranger a ride in the rain. The Elvis who handed out jewelry, cars, even houses to fans and friends without a second thought. The Elvis who once walked incognito into one of his own hotels just to see whether guests were being treated with respect, regardless of how they looked. Elvis Presley is denied access. He was a man who believed that greatness wasn't measured by fame or money. It was measured by compassion. That compassion was tested one night in a way that no one could have predicted. The 1970s were a time when Elvis's concerts weren't just shows, they were events. People flew across the country, even across oceans, just for a chance to be in the same room as him. For many, it was a once-in-a-lifetime dream, to hear that voice in person, the voice that had defined a generation, the voice that critics said could move from a whisper to a thunderclap in a single line. But what if you couldn't hear it? For one young fan, that was the heartbreaking reality. Born deaf, she had grown up in a world without music, without melody, without rhythm, without the sound of Elvis Presley that millions swore was the most powerful instrument on earth. And yet, she loved him. She studied his pictures, his movements, the way he lit up a stage. She could feel the vibrations of his records pressed against the floor. She could read the emotions in his eyes. Somehow, even without sound, Elvis spoke to her. So when she learned that Elvis would be performing within reach, she refused to miss the chance. Her family saved what they could. They traveled miles, not because she expected to hear him, but because she longed to feel him, to be in his presence, to witness the magic that others could only describe to her. It was supposed to be just another concert, another night of music, lights, and the king at his throne. But it would become something else entirely. Because Elvis Presley, the man who had everything, stopped everything. For someone who had nothing. The importance of this story isn't just in what happened that night, but in what it revealed. It revealed the truth that Elvis had carried from his childhood, that music isn't only about sound. It's about connection. It's about soul. It's about looking someone in the eye and making them feel seen, even if they can't hear you. And so, in a crowded arena full of noise, Elvis created a moment of silence. A silence that spoke louder than any song he ever sang. Before we dive into that night, let's remember who Elvis was when he walked on stage. He was adored, yes. He was a global icon, but he was also a man shaped by poverty, by a deep love for his mother, and by a lifelong belief that no fan was too small, no person too unimportant. The king of rock and roll lived his life like every stage was sacred, and every audience member mattered. This is why the deaf fan's story still resonates, because it wasn't about spectacle, it wasn't about fame, it wasn't even about the music. It was about a moment when Elvis Presley stripped away the noise of the world and gave one person everything he had. Not his songs, not his voice, but his heart. And that is why this story, decades later, is still remembered as one of the purest expressions of Elvis's humanity. The night of the concert didn't happen in a vacuum. To understand why Elvis's decision that evening meant so much, you need to understand the world he was standing in, the life he was living, the fans who adored him, and the silent challenges carried by the young woman who had come to see him. By the early 1970s, Elvis Presley was no longer just a man. He was a phenomenon. His name alone could fill entire arenas in minutes. His records were selling in the tens of millions. His image was on everything, magazines, posters, even lunchboxes. For many fans, Elvis was more than a singer. He was a kind of living myth, a figure who seemed larger than life, yet somehow still approachable. But behind all that glitter was a man deeply aware of the fragility of life. Elvis had grown up with very little. Born in a two-room shotgun house in Tupelo, Mississippi, he had known hunger, loneliness, and the kind of poverty that can make a child feel invisible. He carried those memories with him, even when the world placed a crown on his head and called him a king. This background mattered, because it shaped the way he saw people. Elvis never lost the ability to notice the one face in the crowd that wasn't smiling. He could spot the person who felt left out, the one who seemed overlooked, the one who reminded him of his own childhood. He carried his mother's lesson with him everywhere. Treat every soul as if they matter. Because they do. Now, imagine the deaf fan's world in contrast. She had grown up in silence, in an age when accessibility was hardly spoken of, when being deaf was often seen not as a challenge, but as a limitation. While other children were learning lyrics and singing along to the radio, she was left piecing together vibrations, watching mouths move without catching the sound, feeling the weight of exclusion, even in moments of joy. And yet, she found Elvis, even without sound. He reached her. His smile, his body language, the way his music pulsed so strongly that you could feel it through the floorboards. These things spoke to her in ways words never could. Elvis was proof that music wasn't just something you heard. It was something you lived. Her family noticed it. They saw the way her eyes lit up when she held one of his records to her chest, the way she would study his performances on television, focusing on the way he moved, the way his lips formed each word. For her, Elvis wasn't just a singer. He was living energy. He was rhythm, motion, emotion, all things she could understand without hearing a note. So when Elvis announced his concert in her city, her dream took shape. She had one chance to experience him in person, to be surrounded not by silence, but by the roar of a crowd vibrating through her bones. She saved, she prepared, she hoped. And her family, understanding how much it meant, did everything they could to make it possible. The night of the concert, the atmosphere was electric. Fans lined up for hours, some clutching flowers, others waving homemade signs, everyone buzzing with anticipation. To see Elvis Presley in the flesh was like seeing a legend step out of a dream. Inside the venue, the stage was set like a cathedral to rock and roll. Spotlights glared, amplifiers hummed, and the air itself seemed to tremble with expectation. People were laughing, crying, shouting Elvis's name before he even walked out. For the hearing world, it was a wall of sound, an ocean of voices crashing against the stage. For the deaf fan, it was different. She felt it all through her body, the stamp of feet on the floorboards, the ripple of cheers across the rows, the hum of instruments tuning up, not as sound, but as vibrations that traveled through the air and into her chest. She couldn't hear Elvis's name being called, but she could see it in the mouths of those around her, in the frantic energy of waving hands, in the tidal wave of emotion surging through the room. And then he appeared. Elvis Presley walked onto the stage, dazzling in his jumpsuit, commanding in his presence. The crowd erupted, 1,000 voices crashing into one deafening cheer. And though she couldn't hear it, she could see it. She could feel the stadium quaking beneath her. She could see the way his very presence transformed people, how one man could hold an entire arena in the palm of his hand. For her, this was already enough. Just to see him, to feel the waves of energy as he sang to the crowd, was a dream realized. She smiled, clapped, swayed with everyone else, though her silence remained intact. She was surrounded by sound, but lived in her own world, watching with shining eyes. Elvis performed with all the fire that made him famous. He moved across the stage like lightning, hips swiveling, voice rising and falling with that unmistakable richness that could send chills down spines. Fans screamed, fainted, reached out their hands, desperate just to touch the man who had become their idol. But then, something happened. As Elvis moved across the stage, his eyes scanned the audience. He always did this. He loved to connect with individuals, not just the faceless crowd. He would wink at someone, smile at another, point, laugh. But this time, his eyes caught something different. He saw her. The young woman wasn't screaming like the rest. She wasn't mouthing along to the words. She was standing still, her hands over her heart, her eyes shimmering with tears. And in that moment, Elvis knew. He didn't need anyone to explain. He could see the truth written across her face. This wasn't just another fan. This was someone who couldn't hear the music, but who was still giving everything she had to experience it. Elvis kept singing, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't shake her from his thoughts. Who was she? What brought her here? What would it mean to come all this way? To stand in the middle of a roaring crowd, and yet still live in silence. The band played on, the lights swirled, the audience screamed. But for Elvis, time seemed to slow. He felt a pull in his chest, a call to do something, beyond the ordinary, and that was where the tension began to rise. Because what Elvis was about to do next would not just break routine, it would create a memory that outshined even his greatest songs. But in that moment, no one else knew. No one else understood the choice he was weighing inside. To the crowd, it was just another concert. To the young woman, it was a night she would never forget, even if nothing more happened. But Elvis Presley was not about to let her walk away with only that. The music thundered on, the crowd roaring with joy. But for Elvis Presley, the show had shifted. His voice rang out across the arena, yet his attention kept returning to that single young woman standing silently among the chaos. He felt something stirring inside him, an instinct he had always trusted, one that told him when a moment was bigger than the music, bigger than the stage. He had built his career on moments like this, split seconds of connection that could change a song into a memory, a concert into a legend. But this was different. This wasn't about a playful wink or a tossed scarf. This was about something deeper, something he couldn't ignore. Each time he glanced back, he saw her hands pressed to her chest, her eyes locked on him as though she was trying to hold on to every flicker of movement, every vibration of the floor beneath her feet. She wasn't hearing the music. She was feeling it. And Elvis understood, in a way only he could, that she was giving more to this moment than almost anyone else in the room. Still, he hesitated. The band was in full swing, the audience swaying like a single living organism. The lights pulsed, the drums pounded, the guitars soared. He could have let the night roll on like any other. One more show, one more set, one more night on tour. He could have let her remain just another face in the crowd. Her silent story known only to her. But that wasn't who Elvis was. He had always carried a restless spirit, a refusal to let things slide when his heart told him to act. It was the same spirit that made him stop his car on lonely streets to hand out money to strangers. The same spirit that once made him confront injustice in his own hotel lobby. Elvis Presley is denied access, on the same spirit that refused to let anyone leave unseen. As the next song began, Elvis felt the pull stronger than ever. He walked across the stage, his voice booming, but his eyes searching. He came closer to the section where she stood, her family beside her, unaware of what was about to unfold. The crowd around her screamed louder, reaching their hands toward the king, desperate for his attention. But Elvis's gaze was steady. He wasn't scanning the crowd anymore. He wasn't distracted by the sea of fans waving signs or the hands tugging at his jumpsuit. He was fixed on her, and she felt it. The young woman's eyes widened, her breath catching as she realized Elvis Presley, the Elvis Presley, was looking directly at her. She couldn't hear his voice, but she could read the intensity in his expression. For a moment, the noise of the arena faded into nothingness, and all she felt was the weight of his presence pressing down on her like a spotlight. The tension grew with every step he took. The audience noticed his shift, the way he lingered near the edge of the stage, the way his body language changed. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Something was happening, something unusual. Elvis didn't stop singing, his voice still soared, but those closest to the stage could see it in his eyes. He was making a decision. He extended his hand toward the crowd, and for a heartbeat, no one knew who he was reaching for. Dozens of fans reached up, screaming, straining to touch him. The energy was frantic, overwhelming. And then, as if guided by something beyond himself, Elvis leaned down, not to the loudest fan, not to the ones closest to security, but to her. His hand reached for hers. The crowd gasped, voices colliding in a storm of disbelief and awe. The young woman froze, her body trembling, her family urging her forward. Slowly, shakily, she raised her hand. And in an instant that seemed to stretch for eternity, Elvis Presley clasped it in his own. The stadium erupted. People screamed louder than ever before, some crying at the sheer tenderness of the gesture. They had seen Elvis give scarves, kisses, smiles. But this was different. This wasn't showmanship. This was personal. The band continued to play, but Elvis stopped moving. He stood there, holding her hand. the music flowing around him like a river while he stayed rooted in place. He looked directly into her eyes, and for the first time all night, his performance wasn't for the thousands in attendance. It was for her, and her alone. But tension still hung in the air. What would he do next? Would he simply smile, wave, and move on? Would he let the band carry on while he retreated back into the rhythm of the show? Or was he about to break every rule of performance and do something no one could have imagined? The fans leaned forward in anticipation, sensing they were on the edge of witnessing something extraordinary. The silence between beats seemed heavier, the seconds more fragile. The deaf fan's tears spilled over as she clung to his hand, unsure if this was a fleeting kindness or the beginning of something she would remember for the rest of her life. And Elvis knew it. He could feel the weight of that moment pressing against him. He could feel the question written across her face, the hope in her trembling fingers, the way the entire arena had gone from chaos to breathless suspense in the span of a heartbeat. The tension was unbearable now. The band, uncertain, kept playing, but their eyes flicked toward him, waiting for a signal. The audience fell into a strange hush between screams, sensing something monumental about to unfold. Elvis Presley stood there, the king of rock and roll, the man who could command thousands with a flick of his wrist. And yet, in this moment, everything hinged on what he would do for one person. He tightened his grip on her hand, his eyes never leaving hers, and with a small nod, as though answering a question only the two of them could hear, Elvis made his choice. He began to sing, not to the crowd, not to the cameras, but directly to her face. The arena seemed to collapse inward, all noise drowned out by the intimacy of what was unfolding. The audience couldn't believe it. They weren't just watching a concert anymore. They were witnessing a miracle of connection, a performance not of sound, but of soul. But this was only the beginning of the moment that would echo through history, because the true weight of what Elvis did that night wasn't in the song itself. It was in the silence that surrounded it. And that silence was about to change everything. The band continued to play, the instruments roaring through the arena like a tidal wave. But to Elvis, all of that sound faded into the background. He was holding her hand now, and the weight of that touch seemed heavier than the spotlight, heavier than the crown the world had placed on his head. Her eyes were wide, brimming with tears, her whole body trembling with the disbelief of what was happening. In a sea of thousands, she had never expected him to see her, much less stop everything for her. But Elvis had always been a man who noticed what others overlooked. And in this moment, she wasn't invisible. She wasn't lost in the noise. She was the center of it. Elvis leaned closer, still singing, his voice pouring directly into her world of silence. His lips formed the words with precision, every note carried on the strength of his gaze. She couldn't hear him, but she didn't need to. She could read the emotion in his face, feel the vibrations of his voice travel through the stage and into her hand. For her, this was what music meant. Not sound, but presence. Not melody, but connection. The audience could feel it too. The screaming subsided into something quieter, more reverent, as thousands of fans realized they were watching something sacred unfold. People who had come expecting a show were now witnessing an act of pure humanity. Elvis wasn't just performing. He was reaching across a barrier most believed could never be crossed. Every detail seemed magnified. The heat of the stage lights above, the glitter of rhinestones on his jumpsuit as they caught the glow, the tears running down her face, catching the reflection of those same lights, the trembling of her hand in his, steadying as his grip reassured her she wasn't alone. Elvis had sung to millions before, but never like this. He slowed the tempo, softening his delivery even as the band tried to keep pace behind him. His voice, rich and soulful, dropped to a level that seemed impossibly intimate for an arena filled with people. It wasn't about projection anymore. It was about making sure she felt every ounce of emotion he carried in those lyrics. And she did. Her lips quivered as she tried to mimic his words, following the shapes of his mouth, echoing them without sound. Her tears streamed freely now, but she wasn't ashamed. This was the closest she would ever come to hearing the king of rock and roll, and in a way, it was even more powerful than sound. Because Elvis wasn't giving her just a performance. He was giving her his undivided soul. The silence of her world collided with the noise of his, and in that collision, something miraculous was born. The crowd stood frozen. Some cried openly. Others clasped their hands over their mouths in awe. Even the band members exchanged glances, their instruments now feeling secondary to the raw human moment happening at center stage. For those few minutes, Elvis Presley did not belong to the world. He belonged to her. He leaned closer, closing the distance until their faces were only inches apart. His voice strong yet tender as he let the words pour from his heart. She watched his every move, her eyes wide and shining, memorizing the contours of his face, the rhythm of his lips, the sheer devotion in his expression. It was as if the world had fallen away. The sound, the lights, the thousands of strangers surrounding them. There was only Elvis and the young woman whose silent world he had just filled with music. And then, at the height of the song, something extraordinary happened. She began to smile. Not a polite smile, not a small flicker of gratitude, but a smile so radiant, so full of joy, that it lit up her entire being. The tears still flowed, but now they were tears of awe, of fulfillment, of a dream that had somehow leapt out of impossibility and into reality. That smile broke Elvis open. His own eyes shimmered with tears as he continued to sing, his voice wavering with the rawness of emotion. For a man who had sung on the grandest stages in the world, who had conquered charts and shattered records, this was something new, something deeper, something that stripped away every layer of performance and left only the truth. Elvis Presley was singing not to a crowd, not to history, but to a single soul. And in doing so, he was redefining what music could be. The song reached its final note. The band, sensing the gravity of the moment, allowed it to linger longer than usual, letting the last chord hang heavy in the air. Elvis, still holding her hand, let his voice fall into silence. The arena exploded. Thunderous applause, deafening screams, the sound of thousands of voices united in shock and wonder. The audience had just witnessed something that words could barely capture. Many wept openly. Others shouted Elvis's name with renewed fervor, as though trying to pour back into him the emotion he had just given away. But Elvis didn't turn back to them immediately. He stayed with her, still holding her hand, still looking into her eyes. He lifted his free hand and gently brushed the tears from her cheek with his thumb, a gesture so tender that it brought fresh cries from those who saw it. For the young woman, this was beyond any dream she had dared to hold. She hadn't expected to be seen, much less touched, much less sung to by the man she adored. In her silent world, Elvis had created a moment of pure, soundless music, a memory that would live inside her forever, even if she never heard a single note. Finally, Elvis gave her hand a last squeeze before pulling away. His face held a softness, a quiet acknowledgement that this moment had meant as much to him as it had to her. Then, with a deep breath, he turned back to the crowd. The audience erupted again, the roar almost shaking the walls of the arena. They knew they had witnessed something more than a concert. They had seen Elvis Presley at his most human, his most vulnerable, his most divine. The energy of the night was transformed. Every fan in that building now carried the weight of what they had seen. The songs that followed felt different, more powerful, more charged, as though Elvis himself had been changed by what had just happened. And in truth, he had, because for Elvis, that night wasn't about record sales, or headlines, or the size of the crowd. It was about a single connection, a reminder that music wasn't made for charts or critics. It was made for people, for hearts, for souls. And in holding her hand and singing to her face, Elvis Presley had not only given her a gift, he had reminded himself of the deepest reason he ever sang in the first place. That night, the king of rock and roll gave the world a performance no one would ever forget. But for one young woman, he gave something more. He gave her proof that even in silence, music can still be heard, if it is sung from the heart. When the final note faded and Elvis gently released her hand, the arena erupted into thunder. The applause was deafening, a wall of sound that seemed to shake the very foundation of the building. Fans were screaming, crying, clapping until their palms burned. But the young woman stood frozen in place, her hands trembling, her face wet with tears. She couldn't hear the noise crashing all around her, but she could see it. The sea of people rising to their feet, the blur of arms waving in wild, unrestrained awe. And still, none of it compared to the silence she carried inside, a silence that had, for just a few minutes, been filled, not with music, but with presence. With Elvis, the moment lingered like a flame refusing to go out. Elvis stood still at center stage, breathing heavily, his eyes glassy with emotion. The band watched him carefully, waiting for his signal to continue. But Elvis didn't rush. He didn't leap back into another hit song or play to the cameras. Instead, he let the weight of what had just happened settle over everyone present. He wanted them to feel it, not just as a fleeting spectacle, but as a truth that cut deeper than any lyric. And they did. The audience was no longer restless or distracted. They weren't shouting requests or jockeying for his attention. They were unified. Thousands of strangers bound together by the sight of a single act of compassion. Even those in the farthest seats, who hadn't seen her face clearly, knew instinctively that something extraordinary had happened. When the band finally struck up the next number, the energy was different. It wasn't the frenzy of fans desperate for their idol's scraps of attention. It was reverence. It was gratitude. People sang louder, cheered harder, because they understood they weren't just watching an entertainer. They were watching a man who, at the height of his fame, had chosen to stop everything for one fan who could give him nothing in return. Word of the moment spread like wildfire. By the next morning, whispers had already begun to circle through the fan community. Those who were there called friends and family, their voices trembling as they tried to describe what they had witnessed. Reporters picked up the story, writing about how Elvis Presley had paused an entire show to hold the hand of a deaf fan and sing only to her. Some described it as the most tender gesture they had ever seen from a performer. Others said it was proof that Elvis had something no one else in music possessed: the ability to make even the grandest stage feel intimate, personal, human. For the young woman, the aftermath was even more profound. She returned home with her family in a daze, clutching the memory like a jewel too precious to share. For days, she replayed the moment in her mind. The warmth of his hand, the intensity of his gaze, the way his lips had formed every word just for her. It wasn't sound she carried, it was presence, and in her silence, she felt richer than anyone else in the world. She told her story in fragments to those closest to her, her hands moving quickly as she signed the details. Her family translated for others how Elvis had noticed her, how he had stopped the show, how he had sung not to thousands, but to her face. And as the story spread, it became more than just one woman's memory. It became a parable of Elvis's soul. Fans who read about it wept. Letters poured into Graceland from people moved by the tale, many of them from those who lived with disabilities or who had long felt invisible in a noisy world. They thanked Elvis for showing them that even someone as towering as the king of rock and roll could see the overlooked, could pause the thunder of fame to give one person the dignity of being chosen. Elvis himself was shaken by it. Friends later recalled how quiet he was after the concert, how he sat backstage with his head bowed, lost in thought. He wasn't boasting about the crowd size or the set list. He wasn't even basking in the applause. He was replaying that girl's face, her tears, her radiant smile, when his voice poured into her silence. He told those closest to him that night that it had reminded him why he sang in the first place. "It ain't about the lights or the noise," he said softly. "It's about reaching somebody, just one person, so deep that they'll never forget it." In a career filled with glitter and spectacle, this private revelation was a reminder of something he had always known but sometimes risked forgetting: that his greatest gift wasn't just his voice. It was his heart, and the public felt it. Concert-goers carried the story for years, retelling it like gospel. Those who weren't there passed it along anyway, moved by the legend of it. Each retelling grew more powerful, not because of exaggeration, but because of what it symbolized. It wasn't just about one fan and one song, it was about what Elvis Presley represented at his best. He wasn't a distant star. He wasn't untouchable. He wasn't only a man draped in rhinestones, walled off by fame. He was still, at his core, the boy from Tupelo who believed every soul mattered, who believed kindness was a power greater than applause. The tension of that night gave way to a new kind of reverence among his fans. People came to his shows not just expecting music, but hoping for a glimpse of that compassion. They carried banners that read, "Thank you, Elvis," not only for the songs, but for the humanity. And for years afterward, when people asked why Elvis was different from every other performer, the story of the deaf fan would rise to the surface. It became part of his legend. But it wasn't legend to the young woman. For her, it was reality. The memory never dulled, never lost its shine. In her silence, she had been chosen, lifted, and loved by the greatest performer of the age. It became a light she carried for the rest of her life, proof that even in a world where she couldn't hear the music, she could still live inside of it. And for Elvis, it was a reminder he carried too. In the years that followed, through the chaos of touring, the pressure of fame, and even the struggles of his health, he never forgot the power of that single moment. He knew that on his best nights, it wasn't the volume of the crowd or the height of his notes that mattered. It was the depth of his connection. That was the lesson of that night. That was the aftermath.